Hi there. Welcome back to Prices at the Pumps, SaltWire's weekly look at all things energy related. I'm Scott Squires, pleased to be joined, as we always are, by the energy expert, Dan McTagg. Dan, a couple things we're going to go over this week, but we know where we like to start, right? That's where gas prices, diesel prices are headed the next couple of days, adjusted in the Atlantic region tomorrow, Thursday, in Newfoundland and Labrador. The rest of the Atlantic region adjusted on Friday. What are consumers going to wake up to tomorrow in Newfoundland and Labrador? And then the rest of the region on Friday. What do you got for us?
Well, Scott, thank you. And it looks like prices are going to continue their upward trend. Not crazy increases, but and certainly not like we saw a year ago on this very time when gas prices went up in Nova Scotia about 22 cents a liter with 2 carbon taxes being levied, and other provinces saw something similar within the range. Anywhere from 4 to 8 cents a liter with the second carbon tax being implemented. We're not seeing that, but we are going to see a 1.5 cent a liter increase for gasoline in Newfoundland tomorrow for Thursday, which of course is July 4th, a holiday in the United States, and up about 2 cents a liter for diesel. One would have to also think that that number will hold for other Atlantic Canadian provinces. That would mean, of course, PEI, Nova Scotia, and New Brunswick will also see a similar increase, although I think in the case of PEI, we might actually see a little closer to a 3.5 cent increase for diesel and about 3 cents in New Brunswick. But 1.5 cents looks like it's baked into the price, and it really does reflect what is finally happening on world markets. That is that supply is not necessarily keeping up with demand. And there are other factors to be considered, geopolitical ones. Tensions continue in the northern part of Israel, on the border with Hezbollah, not so much with Hamas. We know that the Iranian proxy Houthis in Yemen have threatened to attack any U.S. vessels, along with any ones they purport to have anything to do with Israel in the Red Sea. And of course, we also have at this very same time indications that the U.S. Fed might let up a little bit on interest rates sooner or later. And if that weren't enough, the hurricane season is now well on its way in the United States with Hurricane Beryl, although it may not affect assets in the U.S. Gulf Coast, particularly central coast of Texas all the way out to Louisiana. It's getting awfully close, and that could continue to add upward pressure to the price of gasoline. I note today, you will only hear it first, prices at the pumps at SaltWire, that we have a pretty significant 12 million barrel draw in oil, and gasoline down 2 million barrels, diesel down 1.5 million barrels. The markets will wake up to this, as will those providing the data who've been saying just as recently as a couple of weeks ago, oh no, there's a build in inventories. Looks like the United States government, Department of Energy, has to do a better job at data collection, because having a miss of 12 million barrels suggests that something has gone wrong with the way in which they collect, furnish the data, and it creates a bit of a uncertainty for markets when you see oil inventories plummet by that amount.
So Dan, maybe just expand on that a little bit. Is this a 12 million barrel shortfall that wasn't originally forecast or seen? Maybe expand on what you're saying about these 12 million barrels and what it could mean for consumers.
Yeah, well, the weekly petroleum inventory report has been the sort of go-to for markets, and it's the United States Department of Energy that furnishes this. Normally we see draws, or, we might see builds of, 1 million, 2 million, 3 million barrels on any given week. But to have such a dramatic number, and we've seen it go the other way too, 9 million barrel just 4 weeks ago, a 10 million barrel increase in inventories. Doesn't mean that we have a deficit. What it means is that week over week, something has changed dramatically. Either production isn't meeting demand, or refineries have in fact used a lot more gasoline, which I think is the case as they've sort of built up for the U.S. Independence Day long weekend, which of course comes this week in the United States. So that could be a couple of factors. But it also questions and brings into focus, what does the United States Department of Energy now deem as oil? Is it in fact things like olefins? Is it in fact things like condensates? Is it residual oil? These are things that traditionally can create kind of a murky type of take as to what is considered and thrown in the basket as the United States Department of Energy tries to provide its most accurate understanding of the status of energy. And by the way, it's as of last Friday. So whatever we have today is based on what happened last week and the week before. I don't think it's cause for alarm, but it is and suggests that these wild numbers, where a month ago you could have a week where it was a build of 9 million barrels and now a decline of 12 million barrels, suggests that someone's going to have to do a better job at tightening up the data. One thing is very clear, and we're going to start to see more and more of this. There is going to be a draw on oil supplies globally. They're going to be, of course, cracking down on Russian sanctioned oil. There is concern that China's numbers are not necessarily accurate. They say that their demand is low. It may very well be much higher than we anticipate, but we can't get a straight answer from that country when it comes to things like that anyways. So we have to rely on data we have north and south of the border. And that would mean, of course, that when you look at oil dropping as significantly as that, you normally see the markets respond. Oil prices would shoot up. In fact, they've hardly moved at all, maybe up 12 cents a barrel, which suggests that, again, there's that major dysfunctionality in energy markets that, real analysts in places like OPEC are basically saying, you guys figure it out, you're whacked to begin with. I think that's pretty clear that there's a problem, not just in terms of how investors decide not to put money towards energy to meet that demand, but most importantly, that the numbers we have are not necessarily accurate given week to week disparities, which are pretty significant.
Dan, there seems to be so much murkiness or muddiness right now with oil markets and supply and demand and what's going on with green energy and electrification and everything else. And that brings me to a recent report that's saying that Lufthansa, which is a massive airline, Europe's biggest airline, is looking at introducing next year a 72 pound per flight. So that's around $140, $150 Canadian per flight next year to cover the rising cost of alternative green fuels needed to lower aircraft emissions. What does that say to you? And what could that mean for consumers like myself here in Canada who are going to be looking to fly? And will other airlines look to add this surcharge on as well from what you're seeing?
Well, surcharge would be enough to cause people to rethink their travel plans. And perhaps it may be the beginning of what could be a signal by woke governments to try to destroy the airline industry, whether they realize it or not. These are mandates that, frankly, have no business affecting global travel, but they will no doubt impact commercial activity, which, of course, is the intention of the Greens. They want to shut everything down. They don't want us driving internal combustion engines. They want to control the EVs that we drive. And, of course, they don't want emissions from meat, from cows and other animals. There's a whole host of areas where the attack is coming rather significantly, but the pushback is now pretty clear. We saw what happened in France. We're seeing what's happening in Germany and across Europe. We're seeing what's happening in Canada with the by-election just a week and a half ago. I think people have hit their limit and they've had enough of this woke history because it's not something that's going to increase or change the weather or climate any way, shape, or form. So we know that the Eurozone is in a lot of trouble economically. This is only going to further that while other countries sit back and laugh. Russia, India, China, and can't believe our stupidity at willingness to shut down the very economic vitality of our nation. So I would expect that Lufthansa, which has partnered with Air Canada, which has partnered with American Airlines through that whole organization they once had, we could start to see some of these things meander into other parts of the world. I think this is a short-term problem because, in the next year or so, I think you're going to see several more governments fall who've been advocating this kind of stuff, and there will be a reversal, thankfully, where sanity prevails once again, where reality is restored, and we can get our economic engines back up and running.
And kind of staying with the green initiatives and moves to alternative fuels, electric vehicles, et cetera. a fairly big announcement from Northvolt recently. Now, you and I have talked on prices at the pumps for months and even longer about those big EV battery deals and subsidies that the Canadian government gave to a number of different battery manufacturers, including Northvolt. What do you know about this, and what does that signal to you?
Well, Northvolt knows full well, even in Sweden, that the demand for electric vehicles has cratered, and where there is demand, it's for lower priced EVs, which are not made by Northvolt or by LG or by any of the traditional 13, 14 big international manufacturers. Are made in China by Geely and BYD and a host of others. In fact, most of Teslas that are coming into Canada, as an example, are done with, to a large extent, with using Chinese technology and Chinese parts. Be kind of interesting, by the way, to try to slap a tariff on that when, in fact, you're subsidizing them at the other end. Again, all this makes no sense. But I think even the big companies, as Ford, as Volvo, as Stellantis, as Mercedes-Benz, have all indicated the world isn't ready for this. And imposing mandates is both ridiculous, unnecessary, and very damaging. So with all of this, I think it's pretty clear. Let's put things in perspective. Your federal government invested, nominally $40 billion in order to attract $19 billion in investments to respond to a policy in the United States called the Inflation Reduction Act, which may very well work for their industry and for their automotive sector, but that may be gone in 10 months. If there is a new president and new Congress, they're going to throw that thing out the window because they know it's highly inflationary. It's having the opposite effect. And it may work well for Americans, but it hasn't worked well for Canadians. We're on the cusp edge of what is what I consider the great tsunami of reality that's going to flood all of those out there and turn everything upside down as far as those who believe that renewable energy and ESG and net zero and all these other wonderful policies are somehow worth pursuing. They're not. They're disruptive. They're not just disruptive. They're damaging, and they're really undermining, I think, anyone who has a sort of a green sense of responsibility. Going after one molecule, one inert gas, and turning our society over on its head is not going to change anything other than make people a lot angry. And so politicians who stand for this kind of stuff, you can see a lot of them. And I know a few of them. One that brought in, for instance, censorship, Bill C-59 here in Canada, which basically says if you can prove that you're dropping your emissions and the facts can be challenged, you can be thrown in jail, get a fine for several $1 million. Those politicians who've been pushing this are either not running the next election or going to be defeated soundly in the next election. I think that's pretty clear. One way or another, the country that we know as Canada in 16 months is going to have a very different outlook than the one we currently have to subsist under.
And again, keeping with things that you and I talk about with regularity here on Prices at the Pumps is nuclear energy. We've referenced it before. You've wondered aloud, perhaps why we aren't going further into nuclear energy. And just recently, Bill Gates, a pretty powerful guy, probably one of the most powerful, influential men in the world, was quoted as saying, if we don't build 100 nuclear reactors, we won't make a significant contribution to climate. He was quoted as saying that in Bloomberg. And again, what does that tell you about where we are right now with this transition away from fossil fuels and trying to find alternative fuels? Gates saying that about nuclear reactors, what does that tell you?
Well, what it tells me is that not all wisdom is new wisdom. I've shown this many times before. Little medallion. It says, Pickering Township, Ontario, Canada, to commemorate sod turning of North America's largest nuclear power plant. The date, September 11th, 1965. That was 50 years ago. Well, it's longer than that, almost 60 years ago. Look, these folks who have a lot of money and, fret and use the fear and the panic of weather to try to somehow tell us what we need to do and this is the way we have to go. Sorry, Bill Gates and other elites. Yeah, been there, done that. Long before it was trendy. Yes, nuclear is good. It takes a long time to build nuclear. Maybe there's promise in small modular reactors, SMRs. But that's 10 years down the road. In the meantime, let's use the things we have: propane, natural gas, further our hydro, our natural hydro capabilities. We can do all of these things, but we do them in pace, and not because someone's saying, "Oh, the climate's going to go." Where's Greta Thunberg these days? Most of these people follow the cult of Greta Thunberg, are real scientists, I might add. But 5 years ago, said that the world would face a cataclysm. It didn't happen. It's not going to happen, and we're going to be around a lot longer. Mother Earth is not going to simply choke up and die. It's going to, as George Carlin says, eat us up and spit us out and do its work. I think, for all intents and purposes, the world will look at a diversity of energy needs to meet ever-growing demand. And that demand will continue to increase. Countries like Canada are well placed, as long as we don't have governments walking around telling world leaders, dozens of them, that there's no business case for our energy. As I go back to my previous point, it's only a matter of 15, 16 months before that attitude is simply shelved in this country, and Canadians become a little bit more pragmatic, a little bit more conversant about the great energy diversity and options that we have, all of them, in this country.
Well, Dan, that's why it's great to have you here to weigh in on these things and to bring your insights and clarity to those issues. And now, in a segment that we introduced last week, it's going to be here each and every week now. It is time for Ask the Expert. Our first question comes from Susan in Parsboro. And I know that we're just into July and it's hot and it's summer weather, but in these parts, folks think about the winter, even in July. So the question is, beyond the pump, will the high gas prices we're seeing impact the cost of heating oil this coming winter? If so, by how much can we expect prices to rise? And again, that comes from Susan in Parsboro.
Well, thank you for that, Susan. It's a good question, because we're already starting to see, and it's hot, and we're starting to see diesel and home heating fuel prices go up. Just so you know, home heating oil is pretty much diesel, and the fact that it's going up has to do with economic issues, realities of a stronger economy. Demand is certainly there. We don't just use it for mining. We don't just use it for transportation, jets, trains, buses, large transport trucks. So I am a firm believer that if prices are this high, and I'm looking at the relative price on the New York market, which affects us here in Atlantic Canada. If I'm looking at $2.61 a gallon and gasoline is only $2.60, it means that diesel, which traditionally follows, or home heating oil, which falls below, at a certain period of time during the summer, if it's staying ahead and maintaining that lead, it looks like we're going to be looking at about a 10 to 15 cent a liter increase from what we're paying today by the time we get into the colder weather, say October, November. Now, we do make that shift in reality around the 15th of September, but I think about mid-October, we can start to expect those prices to go right back up. All the more reason why we should not be putting any form of taxation on a product we need to keep warm.
Great answer, Dan. And thank you again to Susan in Parsboro for that one. And a second question comes to us from George in Heartland, New Brunswick. And George asks, with the focus on reducing emissions, are there any alternative fuel sources on the horizon that could realistically bring down gas prices in the next 5 to 10 years? And again, thank you, George from Heartland. Dan?
George, it's a great question. I think you're finding the quality of gasoline, the kind of gasoline, is changing. And that's not to be, too flamboyant about what's happening on the gasoline side, but reduction in sulfur, reduction in overall emissions, but you're paying for it. On the other hand, with carbon credits having to be purchased as those emissions, and we're only talking about one emission, CO2. So are there other alternatives? Yes. But they're very expensive. They're also taxed. So if we look at propane or natural gas, they're taxed. Hydrogen, for every unit of energy that is produced, that produces hydrogen, it takes 2 units of energy to produce it. So we're not there yet. Right now, I think most reasonable manufacturers see now and in the near to distant future, the use of hybrid technology, so that you can get better consumption mileage, if you will, on your vehicles. But there's no silver bullet right now. And this is why saying you're going to have, mandates put in place or imposing higher taxes on fuel doesn't do anything to improve the availability of new technologies. All it does is it makes us all a lot poorer. And to put things in perspective, when you're paying as much as today, 27 cents a liter for the first and second carbon tax, that's 17.61 plus HST. And the second carbon tax between 6 and 8 cents a liter. It's going to go, by the way, to 20 by 2030. It doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to wind up with anything more than a much more expensive product. But be as it may, many companies are working on different types of discoveries, new technologies, less pollution, not just emissions, but pollution in general, and looking to create yet another, technological breakthrough, as we saw with, say, for instance, the introduction of the catalytic converter back in the mid 70s, which basically tanked all pollutions coming from vehicles, or most of them anyways. That technology is still evolving, and we're still a long way off. But in the interim, suffice it to say that higher prices are having a bit of an impact on people's ability to make ends meet and to get from point A to point B.
Well, again, thank you to George for that question, and Susan for the other question. And Dan, just quickly before we kind of wrap up here, you mentioned about the catalytic converter and emission controls. I remember as a kid watching The Price is Right, and when they would have a car as a prize or in the showcase, and they would talk about California emission controls, which were things that were in the vehicle to tidy up the emissions, to help with what was going on with smog and air pollution in California. You hear about emissions and CO2 and everything that's happening with vehicles. I thought the vehicles that we produced here and that we drive here in North America and Canada in particular kind of were really good in terms of tidying up and cleaning up those emissions. Am I wrong? What can you tell me about what vehicles actually emit here and what the standards are in Canada for vehicles?
So around the mid 70s, that CARB, California Auto Air Reduction Board, which is a standard used for California vehicles, became North America standards. So what happened in California, because of the large number, there's more vehicles and people living in California than in Canada at the time. We've since surged dramatically. So that became the new benchmark for how all manufacturers observed. And of course, the EPA, the Environmental Protection Association, and the NHTSA and other organizations involved with not just safety, but also reliability of vehicles, all began to build and conform to a certain standard. And that's why we see across the board much cleaner technology that has come as a result of vehicles having the use of greater fuels, cleaner fuels, but also engines that perform lighter, stronger, better transmissions, better gear ratio, getting rid of the old carburetor, replacing with fuel injection. There's a number of technologies that have occurred that have made it so that fuel itself is extraordinarily reliable, less polluting than at any point in the past, and likely to be so in the years to come, with or without mandates, as vehicles and manufacturers try to eke out that much more efficiency from vehicles. And of course, not just there's 1,000 forms of technology. One can start talking about turbos and others that have been introduced in these vehicles, so that a vehicle running on 4 cylinders today produces as much power as a vehicle 30 years ago that ran on 8 cylinders with a lot less emissions.
Well, Dan, always great to cover these things with you. And yeah, I was having some happy flashbacks to my lunch times watching The Price is Right, and always hearing about what the heck are California emission controls, so that you kind of spelled it out there. Well done. So before we wrap up with you here, of course, we're always happy to have you with us here at Prices at the Pumps at SaltWire. But when you're not with us here, where can folks find you and connect with you, Dan?
Well, affordableenergy.ca, that's the first one. Have a look at the work we're doing there. In fact, some of the articles I wrote today in the Financial Post on the future of EVs, why we don't need mandates. And you can also, of course, engage with me, although sometimes it gets it gets interesting and quite warm when it comes to Twitter or X. And you can reach me there at Gas Price Wizard. But those are the 2 ways to communicate, president at affordableenergy.ca or Twitter, and always happy to answer questions that are really looking for an answer.
Great to chat with you as always, Dan. I hope that you enjoyed your Canada Day weekend. Enjoy the rest of your week. Have a wonderful weekend ahead. The first full weekend, I guess, really true full weekend of summer. Although I guess the Canada Day weekend was kind of the first full day. We're into the summer swing now, right? We're feeling it, right? Dan?
We are. Let's slow it down a little bit so we can enjoy it a little bit more.
I know, hard to believe we're already into the first week of July. It'll be next thing you know, we're going to be seeing the back to school commercials. Oh my, Dan, time goes way too fast, right?
It's the most wonderful time of the year, commercials.
Indeed. Well, listen, Dan, again, thanks for your time. We'll look forward to connecting with you and doing this again next week.
Looking forward to that. Thanks for having me again here on SaltWire. Thanks, Scott.
Pleasure, Dan.